Welcome back to the SpearFactor Podcast. Our special guest today to talk about MPAs and his research and fisheries is Dr. Ray Hilborn. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here.
No, like I said before we started recording, I am legitimately thrilled to have someone that have studied. I read, I would say I summarized, I breezed through your research papers that you have and studied and written, and I have a lot of questions, but I read my own just to start right off, my own opinion kind of does align with what you're seeing. As far as my understanding is that you're more about legislation and proper management versus just outright closures. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Well, it all depends on what your objective is. Okay. But certainly the MPA world came from concerns about overfishing. But it also, and it's really, you have to understand, it really came from a terrestrial perspective that, on land, national parks and other protected areas are in many places really totally essential to maintain the biodiversity. And I've, in addition to working on fisheries, I've done a lot of work on mammals, and I've spent a lot of time in Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. And you just step outside the park and the wildlife's gone. Okay? Now but that's not the case in the ocean. And so that's part of the problem, is there's perspective that if you don't close areas to fishing, there will be nothing anywhere. And so, but and the MPA world started by talking about the decline of fish stocks and the concern about sustainable fishing, et cetera. But I've worked in fisheries now for over 50 years, and I've seen that fisheries can be very poorly managed, and I can see that they can be well managed. And when they're well managed, there is no, you can prevent overfishing by good management, whereas closed areas doesn't reduce fishing pressure. It simply moves it. And that's something that really has caused the MPA movement to sort of shift gears. And they now say, well, it's just about having wilderness areas. Okay. And that's legitimate. I certainly appreciate wilderness areas on land. And, I've been to some marine parks, and they're pretty spectacular. Particularly if they're in a place where there's a lot of fishing going on, it's really stunning how many more fish there are in those areas. And so there's a value in that. But my take on the role of MPAs is, let's define what the objective is, and then let's ask what's the right tool to achieve that objective. And if it's stopping overfishing, it's not closing areas. It's reducing fishing pressure. So coming from a fisheries management background, my perspective is always been, okay, what is it you want that you can't achieve with good fisheries management? And having some areas that are reasonably pristine is a very legitimate objective. But the question is, how much is enough? And the idea that you need 30% of the ocean in protected areas, again, comes from the land. Because on land, if you don't protect it from human development, then biodiversity is largely gone. Although it depends a bit on the kind of development, but certainly industrial agriculture, even subsistence agriculture, essentially eliminates the plants, which is the base of the food chain. And in the ocean, fishing doesn't eliminate the plants. It doesn't eliminate the things that eat the plants. So the base of the food chain in the ocean, even when heavily fished, is largely there. So what's not there as much, if it's heavily fished, is the larger fishes. And it's certainly worth having some areas where you can see those larger fishes. But how much of the area is enough? So anyway, that's a long ramble. get us started.
You answered my question because I was going to ask, what's different from land versus the ocean, but you answered that. So, yeah, I mean, it seems like it's completely, first of all, I think, would you say like humans have a bigger impact on land just because that's where we live? So we play a bigger role.
But fundamentally, the human use, whether it's where we live or where we grow our food, transforms the ecosystem totally. And I mean, I certainly accept it because that's how we produce food. That's how we feed whatever 7 billion people we are now. And my son's a farmer. And he's an industrial farmer. He farms 500 or 600 acres. My wife was a farmer, grew organic vegetables. We actually owned the farm for a while. So I know about farming. I respect farming, but I also recognize it's fundamentally different than fishing because in farming, you eliminate the native ecosystem and you put in specific crops, and almost everything disappears. Even in Africa, in the subsistence farming, which is nothing like, this is very, very small scale farming. 90% of the biodiversity disappears as soon as you leave the park. And the ocean, that's simply not true at all. That most of the biodiversity is outside of any closed areas, even in, along the California coast. Most of the abundance of fish is not in closed areas. So closed areas have a pretty special role of just providing these unique, less modified habitats. But as part of maintaining healthy, functioning ecosystems, you typically don't need to stop fishing. You may need to restrict certain kinds of fishing, but you don't need to have no-take areas to maintain naturally functioning ecosystems in the ocean.
So, Doctor, how do you think it is with everyone looking at the same data? And I read a little bit of Dr. Jen Cassell, I believe that's how you say her last name, research with the Channel Islands MPAs exclusively, and her one of the decade review, her 5-year review, and their 10-year review of the MPAs, which I actually found kind of interesting because there wasn't a whole lot of evidence other than there's a lot more fish of targeted species in these MPAs, but everything else was pretty much the same, which makes sense to me because they're not fishing them. But it seems like that could be fixed more with rules and management rather than just outright closures, like you said. But how can we have researchers all study the same data, all look at the same stuff, and this is a genuine question that I have, and be on so different far ends of the spectrum? Like, how do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think that to some extent that difference is exaggerated. And a lot of it has to do with the objectives. That if the objective is to have some places with more fish, then there's no question that is going to happen if there's a lot of fishing pressure. So if you look at the 10-year review from the MLPA, there's no more fish even inside the closed areas in the northern section of California because there's not much fishing pressure there. In Southern California, there's more fish inside the reserves. But I think Jen was a co-author on a paper that came out of UC Santa Barbara, looking at the Channel Islands area and asking, are there more fish, even of the targeted species, because of the MPAs? Not inside the MPAs, but overall. And the answer is, we did not find any evidence that there are more fish targeted or untargeted. Targeted, there's more fish inside, but there's actually fewer outside because guess what? That's where the fishing effort went to.
Right.
So I think a lot of it has to do with the objectives. And then also, some people, and particularly in the advocacy groups, they get caught up in what is, it's just basically, what I would call bogus science. The idea that if there's a gradient at the edge of the MPA, which if there are more fish inside the MPA, then typically if you look at the difference between inside and outside, there's fewer outside. Okay. But they take that as evidence that it means there's more fish overall. It's spillover. So you've got fish inside and they're pumping out outside. That's simply not evidence that there's more fish overall. It's simply evidence that there's more fish inside than outside.
No, that's one of the things that I've read, and I know what you're talking about, which paper where she co-authored, and they said the eastern or the western areas had Santa Rosa, I believe, or San Miguel Island had fewer fish, and they didn't see much of an impact at all on an MPA versus the eastern side. The MPA is closer to shore. My question to that is, I was looking at the chart, and I don't have it here with me, but it seemed like as a fisherman, I'm always wondering, okay, what period of time did you collect the data? What was the current? Because as you know, you can check for fish as we hunt fish. You go up current, and if the current is pushing away from the MPA and you check that MPA, you could easily say there's no fish there. And then if you went back on a different time where the currents moved, and now the MPA is in the upward side of the current, you could say there's a lot more fish. So I'm not critical at all, but I'm very I like to look at everything from that perspective and try to understand what we're looking at without an agenda. I do think that, and I've talked to Matt Bond, I don't know if you know Matt, and Mike Wade. I've talked to all from All Waters, and one of the things was, and I honestly am new to this whole thing. I try to stay out of everything. I just, but it gets to a point where it just seems to be absurd, some of the stuff they're proposing. And I don't know if the science is behind it or if lobbyist groups are behind it at some point. But when you say, I'm trying to think about anyways, I got sidetracked, but I think it's very interesting that you have both sides of science debating two opposite sides. And I know what I was going to ask now. What was the original purpose of the MPAs? Because it seems like the goal keeps shifting to now the word is kelp restoration, when if you look in the northern California, bull kelp got wiped out in the MPAs as well. It doesn't seem to be addressing some of the outside factors like pollution and other things like that, global warming, if you will, heating of the ocean and all that stuff. But yet then they're targeting fishing. And it just seems to be a little weird that, okay, now we went from trying to restore fish stock to the kelp. So now we need to close off all of Point Loma to help restore kelp. Have you, do you know what the original I'm assuming you do. What was the original purpose of MPAs?
Well, it all depends, and it depends on what you mean by original. But if you sort of the American MPA movement was largely motivated by a number of ecologists at Oregon State University, UC Santa Cruz, UC Santa Barbara. I know I'm forgetting one more. Who got a lot of money for a thing called PISCO, Partnership for Interdisciplinary Study of the Oceans, and they produced a report that was called The Science of Marine Reserves in the early 2000s. And it, right up front, it said the oceans are being threatened, food production and livelihoods are being threatened. Okay, but even at the same time that was written, the same group was very influential in the passage of the Marine Life Protection Act in the California State Legislature, and it basically doesn't mention livelihoods or food production. It's now about protection, and that's one of the that's one of the big changes. I'd say there's been two changes in the MPA movement. One is, what's the objective? And it's moved from benefiting people through food and livelihoods to protecting the ocean. And the other has been its move from being, in theory at least, science-driven, which was how the MLPA was implemented, that there were science guidelines. I mean, I found them very dubious, but they were, nevertheless, it was, it attempted to specify some science guidelines and use those to set it up. But they discovered that was kind of tough. It was very expensive and took a long time. And they really switched modes into, at the high end, going to the President of the United States and saying, close these large areas and you will be an environmental hero. Started with George Bush, Bush number 2, then Obama with the expansion of all these national monuments, which was a mechanism that let them avoid the U.S. legislation like the Environmental Protection Act and requirements for scientific review. So these were totally non-scientific. They were simply saying, here's a really big area, close it, and you'll be a hero. And they got the President of the United States to do that. They've got the President of, the Prime Minister of New Zealand and Australia, of Kiribati, of Palau. All these presidents or prime ministers closed large areas of their economic zone because they were promised, A, you would be an environmental hero, and B, certainly for the Pacific states, you were promised that it would actually be good for your economies through tourism. Now, it turned out to be totally bogus. And Kiribati has reopened the big area called the Phoenix Islands Protected Area because they were losing a lot of money they'd been getting from letting foreign fleets fish tuna in their waters. I'm not quite sure where Palau has gotten. They were talking about, or certainly of reopening some of their areas, but that's been the big change. And then also pushing through at the very high international level this 30 by 30 commitment to close there, to protect. I say protect, which is, remember, protection is different from closing. And that's a point you actually brought up. That's one of my critiques of the MPA movement in general. Is they claim they're protecting the ocean, but I say, what are you protecting it from? You are not protecting it from climate change. You're not protecting it from terrestrial runoff. You're not protecting it from oil spills. You're not protecting it from exotic species. You're not protecting it from ship traffic. The only thing you're protecting it from is fishing. In some cases, some of the MPA prevent deep sea mining, for instance. But in terms of what's actually threatening marine biodiversity, particularly coastal marine biodiversity, MPAs aren't doing that. And yet they're sort of congratulating themselves. Oh, we're protecting this area. Going to kelp, I think the reason there's so much emphasis on kelp is because that's the only place they've been able to show that there is some benefit to these protected areas to biodiversity. Because, their 10-year review from the California State Fish and Wildlife, said there has been no regional change in biodiversity as a result of the closed areas. It also, and then go back to the Channel Islands, the report from the Channel Islands, I said, showed there's no increase in the abundance of fish. And in fact, the 10-year review of the Marine Life Protection Act never even attempted to ask if there's more fish. They simply say, yeah, there's more fish in some of the areas, which for some objectives is part of the objective. That's legitimate. And again, if you look at their 10-year review, it devotes 4 pages of over about 100 pages to the biological impacts of the changes in biodiversity and the changes in abundance. It devotes on the order of 15 to 20 pages on research, on enforcement, on public outreach. So basically, the Marine Life Protection Act has become a public relations exercise. It's not really having any impact on the biodiversity of California's coastal ocean.
So I actually am so glad you brought that up, because as I was reading it in the morning, drinking my coffee, and I'm not a reader, so that was quite challenging, because what I found is that it was filled, and again, this is my naive but honest approach or honest opinion. I thought it was filled with a lot of fluff and not a whole lot of meat. And so I actually found myself skimming through, like, okay, where is the date? Okay, finally got to it.
Yeah,
and I looked at it. Right. And I was actually surprised by that. Because there was a lot of and that kind of led me to my question. I was talking to Matt Bond. I was like, so what are the goals of it? Because they don't really provide much supporting evidence for the main goal, but then they fill it with all this other stuff that seems to be, byproducts, and kind of switch the focus from the secondary or what, what they perceive to be the benefits of it away from the main goal, which I thought was increasing fish stock and protecting the fish.
Yeah. Well, but clearly they've shifted gears, because they got no real success story to show in terms of protecting the fish, outside of having some areas in Southern California where there's more targeted species, more individuals. But there's another thing as a spearfisherman I think you might like, and this is almost never discussed. I've only seen one or two papers, and that is the way they measure success is typically by diving and counting fish on transects. So you lay a rope down along the bottom, and you swim along that, and you count the fish you see within a meter on either side of the line or something. That's a typical survey. And I've got a database of almost 2 million records of these dive surveys around the world on coral reefs. Very, very standard technique. And the other that's now, I can't remember the acronym for the program, is one where they actually go in and do fishing, directed fishing inside and outside. It's catch and release fishing. It's organized as a public participation scientific program. But what all of these things ignore is the fact that in areas that are fished, the fish themselves become much shyer and harder to see. That if they're not disturbed, they swim around a lot. But if they've been fished, the ones who are really out there swimming around are the ones that have been caught. They're gone. And the ones that are much more cryptic aren't. So there's pretty good evidence that the difference between inside and outside, to some extent, is the difference between the visibility of and the catchability of fish that have been fished in areas that have been fished, and as opposed to areas that haven't been fished. And I wouldn't be surprised if you've seen that, if you spent a lot. I'm not a diver, so I don't know. But
yeah, I have absolutely seen that.
Yeah,
I mean, and not only that, on so many different levels, which when you first start diving, if you dive with a newer person, and I remember being the newer person and saying, I don't see anything. And my buddies are popping up. Oh, I see this, I see that. They're like, yeah, you just don't really see sea bass when you start, hunting or whatever. So you develop an eye for it. The other thing that I have noticed time and time again is, especially diving, is you'll go over a reef and it'll turn on and turn off in an hour, half hour, depending on the tides. The other thing is sunset, sunrise. There'll be fish everywhere, and then it's a ghost. I've seen this a lot in the Sea of Cortez, where the grouper and everything else will be in the caves and in the holes, but come nighttime, dusk or dawn, they come out of the woodwork, and you're like, we're idiots. We should have just stuck to the basic stuff that we've talked to, saved ourselves the time, go in, have lunch, relax, and then go back out.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting though. I've heard that and I've seen that, and I can tell you, I have done a little bit of research, been on a research vessel myself with a deeper ROV through my real job, and it's kind of impressive when you go out on these boats and you get in the water, if you do dive around, to know what I'd say we know in our fishing community, is spending years underwater and developing an eye and knowing when to see fish. And I thought about this the other day when I was drinking my coffee. The same thing, reading this, was if they're taking samples based on an undergraduate student, and I don't know, this is all completely naive. Obviously, Dr. Jen has been diving a lot. 2005 was a Science Woman of the Year or something. She's got an eye probably keen to it, but it's taken me, I've been diving now for about 30 years almost. I got certified when I was 12. So more than that. Spearfishing, probably 25, 30 years. And it's taken me a long time to start to see fish and really start to recognize everything. And I feel like if you're in maybe an undergrad student, or just, started getting into dive, say you got 4 years on your belt and you're trying to count fish, there's a high likelihood that you're not going to be as accurate as maybe someone that's been counting fish, for 10 years. So I feel like you're inviting this huge deep delta between whoever's counting fish that day. I mean, I know for diving, if you ask a diver on another side project I have, where it's like, what was the visibility like? They'll say it was 20 feet. You ask their partner and he said it was 10, 12. And you get this massive deviation. So to put so much effort on such little success based on those types of observations, I just feel like, we need to be, there's got to be a better way to do it, which is tough because it's the ocean. And B, if we're putting so much faith in the way that data, then you have to look at the way we're collecting that data and understand that there could be a lot of error within that. Now, granted, if they're doing it over, and I know they're doing it over decades, so that would make it a little less impactful. But I know that areas turn on and off in a like a light switch. But I also know that when I go snorkeling in La Jolla Cove, how many 8-pound sand bass or 8-pound calico bass swim right up to you like, hi, friend. And I always said, the problem that I have with the MPAs is once they close it, there doesn't seem to be a plan on opening it. And then if they were to open it again after being closed for over a decade, every poor living creature in there, everybody that wants to shoot a monster fish is going to go there and decimate that place in a matter of days. And that just doesn't seem ethically right. But have they considered rotating, like maybe closing areas? I know reef species tend to be a little more slow growing, but have they considered doing some sort of rotational or slot limit ways to conserve, rather than just closing MPAs and leaving an MPA permanent?
Well, that's a choice of the management agency, in this case, California Fish and Wildlife, because that is fisheries management. And there are rotational harvesting is an accepted practice in many places. It's particularly used a lot in small scale fisheries in the Western Pacific. It's a form of traditional management. You close areas for a while, then you reopen them. It's used in terms of large scale fisheries. Slot limits are pretty common, I believe, both in not just in spearfishing, but in hook and line fishing. I don't really know anything about how spearfishing works. But commercially, the second most valuable fishery in the United States is the Atlantic sea scallop fishery off of mid-Atlantic and New England. And it's one of its primary management tools is rotational, because the scallop dredge is very indiscriminate in terms of size. and if you go and so if you and you want to let them get big, because you get a lot more yield if you let them grow to be big. So the way that works is you don't harvest it an area for 4 or 5 years, and then you go in and you harvest it, and you have lots of big individuals, and you let it rest for 5 years. When you come back, you'll have lots of large individuals again. Whereas if you go every year, no one's going to get a chance to be big. But that's outside of the whole design. I mean, that's the problem, is the MPA movement is not coordinated with the fisheries management system. And closed areas are a long established tool, part of the fisheries management toolbox. And, again, going beyond state waters, but for the whole region of California, during the rockfish rebuilding program, closed areas was a very primary tool. The cowcod conservation areas, I think they're still in place.
They are.
Yeah. But anyway.
No, I thank you. I think that was my biggest complaint, is that it didn't seem like it was just, we're so focused on closing, but there seems to be so many other things that could be more effective than just closing something. But the other thing that I always say, which surprises people, is I'm not against MPAs. Like you said, to me, it's more of a museum, and it's really cool to be able to take, say, my daughter snorkeling in there and getting her exposed to wildlife and things that she wouldn't see other than at Scripps Aquarium or something, the Birch Aquarium, and develop an appreciation for for the local fishery and the fish that are there, and to really learn them. And then one thing that I did, which I did kind of the same thing when I was in Guam, we went to Fish Eye, which is a preserve, and my friend was like, hey, let's go diving there. It's a preserve, and you see all these fish species, that are massive and healthy and all of that, but you learn what fish, that one tastes really good. Those, you start learning what they look like, what their traits and all of that. And then you can carry that outside the preserve and realize you're never going to see a fish that big outside the preserve. But it's really cool to see that, to learn that way. And I did the same thing with my kids, and it was really a really fun treat. So I'm not exactly for it or against it. But the one thing that I've noticed with this recent study, this recent effort that's going on, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but they wanted to close down and expand the Cabrillo MPA to essentially the whole kelp. I think it was like 5 miles, 6 miles of Point Loma. And they have 2 MPAs already in La Jolla. And that area, Point Loma and La Jolla, pretty much makes up most of the fishing areas, especially in southern San Diego, south central San Diego. But I said, I just did the numbers, and I looked at, if you close the entire Point Loma, you're going to shift all fishing to 2 to 3, or to just about 3 miles. So you're shutting down 6 miles of fishing, and you're concentrating 3 miles of coastline left over in La Jolla to take on all the fishing. And then you're going to create what it seems like they're trying to prevent, or I have my own little conspiracy theory, but you're going to definitely have an impact to fishing, because proportionally it's just offset. So we talked about like the 30 for 30, and there doesn't seem to be impact outside of fishing. Well, when you completely throw that proportion off to the most viable fishing resources in San Diego, and now you just shifted every bit of fishermen, either the ones that aren't going offshore, usually the ones that can afford really nice boats go offshore, but everybody else, we're going locally, either from shore or on smaller vessels around there, and it's shifting 6 miles of coastline shut down and putting all that pressure on the 2 to 3 miles really in La Jolla. And then you're going to have absolutely a fishing shortage, I feel like. And then this is where the conspiracy of Brett's conspiracy takes over. Then they're going to use that as an argument to say, look, fishing is an issue. We need to shut this whole place down. And that is my biggest concern. Number one, don't destroy the habitat that we have left for the sake of making a point. And then number two, now we're going to shift all pressure onto certain areas and cause a major issue in La Jolla. And I guess that's a long way to say, like, I mean, have you looked at that at all? And do you have any thoughts on as far as that goes, as far as putting outside fishing pressure on areas that necessarily can't handle it? I mean, now maybe they can handle it, but not if they keep going forward with the 35-30.
Well, not specifically. Certainly, I mean, I've been there, but I don't know any of the details. But I mean, what you're describing is the fact that you're moving effort. You're not. I mean, there'll probably be some reduction. Some people just wouldn't bother to go. But in general, all you're doing is moving effort. And so the claim is that that the areas that are protected are more resilient to climate. And there's a little bit of evidence in some of the MPAs that kelp rebuilt faster after the marine heat wave than areas that were outside. And for some areas, they ascribe this to the fact you have large lobsters and cabezon, or no, is it sheep's head? That actually can crunch urchins. But let's assume that areas inside reserves are more resilient to climate change, like marine heat waves, because they've got less fishing pressure. Doesn't that mean the areas outside are therefore less resilient because they have more fishing pressure? So is the whole coastline more resilient, or are you again just choosing a couple areas that are going to be the ones that are benefiting, while all the rest of the area where the effort goes is going to be in less shape? So what you're describing is part of that same thing, is but with a little bit of a more long-term dynamic. That, well, then if you really devastate the areas that's still open, then you'd say, oh well, we have to close that too. And yeah, that's well.
Have you looked at any consideration of, like, when they reach saturation for the population of that MPA area, like where if we leave it there, eventually that area is going to be saturated with, or like there's only so many holes for Garibaldi, there's only so many, big lobster, and is that what they're kind of hoping for will help force the spillover, like, into other areas?
Yeah. That is, you would expect that as the density of species builds up inside a protected area, that a greater proportion of them would move outside. Although most of the argument for spillover is larvae. That so in an ideal world, if the species is reasonably sedentary, then you would build up to sort of the unfished condition for those targeted species. Okay, and the result is that most species, not all, have larvae that are highly dispersive, and so they would go and seed the areas outside, and that's again part of the terrestrial analog, because a lot of the early work on MPAs was from places where fishing was really intense, and there wasn't much outside the reserves, and in which case that's sort of quite a legitimate argument. Yeah, you have some areas that are producing a lot of larvae and eggs that spill over and seed those areas, but unless you're really overfishing, and even in Southern California, it isn't any clear that they're being overfished, meaning that you've got lots of the fish outside the protected areas. So that spillover won't really be changing much. That most of the egg production is happening inside the spillover. I mean, outside. Most of the egg production is happening outside your what right now is about 15%. Make it 30%. Still, almost most of the egg production and larval production is coming from outside the closed areas. And in one of my, an interesting example is lobster. Okay. Now, lobster larvae disperse for a year. They go way offshore. And the idea that, I believe it is widely accepted that most of the lobster larvae that settle in the San Diego area have come from Mexico, because the currents bring them north. So the idea that somehow these protected areas are causing their larvae to spill over the next adjacent 2 or 3 kilometers when these things go offshore for a year, it just makes no sense that larval spillover is not benefiting adjacent areas for lobster. And I know I was part of a study that looked at an MPA in the Mediterranean for a lobster, and there was a pretty significant impact of that MPA on the local fishery. But it all had to do with, because it was a very intense fishery, or it still is. But inside the MPA, the lobsters grow much bigger. And so when they do leave, then that's the only time the fishermen ever see big lobsters, is when they're spilling over from inside the reserve. And so we concluded that MPA is benefiting the local fishermen, because it was a place where fishing pressure was grossly excessive. There was it was truly not much outside the reserve.
Yeah, the Mediterranean, I've heard, is legendary for that. I know the spear fishermen have to dive real deep, like deeper than I would, to shoot like a 18-inch fish. With your travels, I know I travel a lot in Asia for work, and it seems the most frustrating thing is I feel like in the United States, we do all of this. It started to trickle down to Mexico. You see it a little bit down there. And we do all this stuff. Excuse me. And then you go to, laws and efforts to conserve. Then you go over to the Western Pacific, and you see, or when I was in the Persian Gulf, and you just see complete opposite, pillaging, dirt, like pollution, nobody. And I've seen this on land and sea. And it just doesn't seem to really, it kind of gives a feeling of hopelessness, where it's like, if we're the only ones doing something. And has there been any pressure, or what you have seen? Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen when you traveled? I know Palau has an amazing amazing fishery from friends that have been there and spearfished, and it's incredible. It's also in the middle of it's pretty isolated. And a lot of those other islands are pretty isolated. But can you kind of talk a little bit about what you've seen in your travels?
Well, the intensity and the effectiveness of fisheries management is very different all around the world. And in particular, most of the fishing boats in the world are in South and Southeast Asia. It's like 80 or 90% of the fishing boats are, you're starting in India, going through to it's to China, and in general, those countries have very little effective fisheries management. Now, doesn't mean that most of their stocks are overfished. But I think the latest FAO estimate was, maybe they might have 40% of their stocks overfished, whereas the global average might be 30%. Now, got to remember, what overfished means is fished harder than to produce maximum yield. So you can be sustainably overfished. And all that really means is that you could have caught more if you hadn't fished as hard. I don't know. I just reviewed a paper that looked at the the Bohai Sea in China. And I think they concluded that really only about a third or a quarter of the species were actually fished so hard that they were losing a lot of yield. But those are the countries where fishing pressure is very intense, that, typically large species are gone. and where MPAs would really be beneficial. But they're not where MPAs are being put. Okay. MPAs are being put in the countries who need it the least. The U.S., Australia, Canada, New Zealand, to some extent the European Union. These are the countries that are where you've seen large numbers of MPAs put in, and they're the last places in the world where they're really going to be beneficial to people. That's just the facts of life. And in terms of area, most of the area MPAs has been put in large ocean areas like the U.S. monuments in the Pacific, like Kiribati, the Phoenix Islands protected area, those areas. And those are areas where all they're affecting is tuna fish, and highly migratory species that swim in and out of even those areas that are gigantic. Fish swim in and out. And the analysis that's been done suggests that these closed areas are having really no impact. The same number of fish are being caught outside. They swim in and out. They're nominally protected areas, but the only thing they're doing is moving the tuna fisheries or a fishery around and not really affecting the tuna bycatch species. It has no impact on the bycatch species because they're being caught outside because they get caught by the same gears that would have caught them inside. So,
that's funny you say that, because in Guam, there's a joke sort of where they protected the sea turtles, and they're not allowed, the local people aren't allowed to take sea turtles. And the joke is they just preserve them so that when they get to the Philippines, they can get eaten there, because everyone's eating them there, and that's the way they migrate. So again, I don't know that much about it. It's just kind of one of those things.
It depends. I know a lot about turtles because I'm doing some work with some turtle biologists, and turtles are doing great. That they're a real conservation success story. That we've largely stopped large-scale turtle harvesting. There's still local consumption going on in some places, but with the exception of loggerheads, turtles are increasing around the world. And in Hawaii, I think there's a movement to start to allow some indigenous harvest of green turtles.
So what do you think? Why do you think that is as far as for turtles? Is it the hatchery that they're all those efforts, or
it's not it's basically protecting the beaches where they lay their eggs and stopping industrial scale harvesting and reducing bycatch through a number of techniques like circle hooks instead of J hooks and things like that. But so the bycatch and the directed harvest of turtles has gone down a lot. It's like the marine mammal success story. Globally, marine mammals are increasing at a rapid rate, whether it's the large whales or pinnipeds. Again, I'm working with a group on just looking at pinnipeds, and they're booming around the world. There's in every case there's exceptions. Hawaiian monk seals are not booming,
right?
And North Atlantic right whales are not booming. But the big picture is our conservation efforts for those species have been very successful.
Yeah, and I also know the porpoises, I believe, in the northern Sea of Cortez, they are not booming as well.
Oh, the vaquita. Yeah,
yes,
they're going to go extinct in our lifetime.
Yeah, I've several friends that were involved in that effort.
Yeah. I've had a student who worked on that, and I was involved. I was on their recovery team for a while back 20 years ago or so. So there's lots of conservation concerns. And, that would be, I mean, the northern Sea of Cortez, where the vaquita are found, and that is where they're being caught in illegal fishing. Yeah, I mean, it would be, I mean, it's in a reserve, but it's not enforced.
Right. And that was one of the things that I wanted to.
Just a second.
Yes, sir.
Need to, I got to turn that on. Okay, sorry.
That was one of the things that I looked at too, is that a lot of these countries that, you could put whatever you want up, but if you don't pay anybody to enforce it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've seen even in Mexico as well, where it's like, we're in a preserve. Okay, I bought this bracelet. There's no one here to enforce anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mainly by the border, the military are checking everything. But other than that, I laugh. I'm like, I can't remember the last time anyone's ever checked my fishing license ever.
Oh, really? I went out fishing with my son and he got busted because he had his license in his other jeans.
No, I'm speaking
of
$100. Yeah, I'm talking about just spearfishing in Baja. But in the U.S., that's another story, which is great. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, I think it's great. And that's one of the things that I think that is getting overlooked globally. It's that you're going to have to, some of these countries don't have a lot of money. Some of them do. Some of these smaller, they need support. And so you could put all these MPAs up if you want. There's no one there to protect them. Yeah. They'll just move in and,
well, I mean, I would say the major U.S. foundations recognized this a while ago. So I'm here thinking of the California foundations, Packard and Moore, and the Walton Foundation, which are the three foundations that I've done a lot of work with. And about 15 years ago, they commissioned a report on what are their, where should they be allocating their resources. And I was part of the group that contributed to that. And they concluded that they'd been spending most of their money in the U.S. and it was the wrong place, that the U.S. was the least place that needed marine conservation. And they really shifted their allocation of resources to, in this case, to the Coral Triangle, because that's, that's definitely a good move.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I want, when I said in my letter to everyone, both for and against, is that I think I've seen lately people demonize other people and all this stuff for difference of opinion. But as far as this goes, I think everyone loves the environment. I don't understand how you can't spend as much time as you do either fishing or diving or whatever, just in the wilderness and the wild and the woods and the ocean, and not have an affinity for it and its inhabitants. And it's like everyone wants to preserve this. So we're all fighting for different ways which work to preserve it. And yet that's kind of my biggest point, I guess, was if the closures work, great. But what they seem to be working for is just closing that area and providing for, fish that are targeted in that area. And then that is it. Which is great if you just want to preserve an area where people can swim and be in an aquarium, essentially. But as far as the bigger picture of preserving, conserving the ocean as in its entirety, like it's not going to work. There's other tools in the toolbox that seem to be out there that they're not really getting talked about or getting used as much as they should.
Those other tools have a name in the conservation rules called other effective conservation measures. So 30 by 30, which has been accepted by the Convention on Biodiversity, of which I believe the U.S. is a signatory to, but about most of the countries of the world has accepted this 30 by 30 pledge. And that is to protect 30% of the land and ocean area. Okay, now, I actually think it's not ambitious enough. I think we should protect the whole ocean, but we should protect it from the threats. And in the text for the of the Convention on Biodiversity, it says it can be by marine parks or other effective conservation measures, and those are measures that are specifically designed to protect biodiversity, and it's left up to the country to decide what those are. So, I would argue that any area that you are, let's say, as an example, declaring a no bottom trawl area for the specific purpose of protecting benthic ecosystems. That's an effective conservation measure. And so you could allow fishing inside of a kelp bed, hook and line fishing, if you banned trawling, and that would count as 30 by 30. That would count towards the 30% goal. And the hardcore preservation movement really is opposing that. And the U.S., the U.S. government's perspectives change so drastically with administrations. It's really hard to say. But from California's perspective, I don't know what they're considering OECMs. Because even within the MLPA, there's different levels of protection. So I would say that, trawling is banned for almost all of California state waters. So to me, most of California state waters are already protected from some of the threats. And got to recognize, again, go to this point, what are the threats? And there's a whole bunch of things that neither fisheries management nor MPAs are going to protect from. And then for the coastal ecosystem, those are the major threats.
That's I'm really good you brought that up, because I wasn't aware that is also included. That basically counts for the 30 by 30. And I agree with you. I know, talking to friends, and one of my buddies that mentored me in spearfishing is a few years older than me, but he was talking about, specifically always talk about white sea bass or yellowtail. And he was talking about how, as soon as they banned those gill nets, he's like, I'm not a scientist, but just from a diver that's been sticking his face in the water, there seems to be a lot more sea bass than there was back then. And he thinks a lot of it was just preventing those types of fishing measures when you're talking about someone netting X amount of, hundreds or thousands of sea bass versus, I know they're putting a lot of effort in the hatchery as well, getting rid of some of those, destructive fishing measures, and try to manage it better. And he said he's seen a difference. And honestly, after 20 years, I see a difference as well. Just my own, research, if you will, just diving. But that's really interesting, because there's a lot of things that seem just to make sense, where it's like, I know we have to feed everybody, but there seems to be a smart way to do things, or maybe it's not a one-stop shop for everybody, but there could be it seems like there could be a more strategic approach to things other than just closing off everything. And that's kind of like my biggest complaint about it. Just, there's a lot of really smart people that I do respect, because they're fighting for what they believe in, fighting for the environment. I cannot not respect that. But it seems like, are we not on the same page, or are we not, is there other things that we can do to reach these goals? Everybody working together, including fishermen and conservationists. One thing I did want to get into, which, number one, I didn't talk about your background at all, and I probably should have done that first. But before we get into a little bit of your background, which it's pretty awesome. But before we get into that, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about, there's a lot of controversy. Like, you've been attacked by the opposing side, but other scientists that maybe disagree with you. And one of the controversies, they said that you're like a lobbyist for fleet fishing. And again, I'm paraphrasing everything, but do you mind elaborating on that, or at least addressing that if you feel comfortable. If you don't, well, I can cut it out and we don't have to talk about it.
Well, I mean, I'd say I'm not. I certainly come from a background of in fisheries management, and my initial experiences in that world were in particularly well managed fisheries. So for the last more than 25 years, I've had a major research project in a salmon fishery in Bristol Bay, Alaska. It's one of the classic examples of a well-managed fishery. It's also unusually a climate winner. We've had record returns for the last decade. I mean, and we know it's the record in the last 1,000 years. But it's also very well managed. So I came from that background that of a well-managed fishery is very sustainable. It doesn't have a heavy impact on the environment. So am I an advocate for commercial fishing and industrial fishing? No, I'm not advocating for it in the sense that I'm just simply saying that it is a way of producing food that is very sustainable and has low impact compared to other forms of food production. Because that's actually one of the big changes in my perspective happened in 2010, because I actually started my life as a terrestrial ecologist, and I still, as I mentioned, I've done a lot of work in Serengeti National Park, and the director of the programs for the Frankfurt Zoo, who's the big NGO in Serengeti, he said, "Listen, I'm an environmentalist. Should I stop eating fish?" And he showed me the cover of a Time magazine from November of 2009 that had a picture of a piece of sushi and saying, "Is this the end of fish?" And it was sort of your classic fish are all disappearing story. And so his name was Marcus Borner. I said, "Well, Marcus, if you don't eat fish, what are you going to eat?" And he said, "Well, I'm not a vegetarian. I'd eat more beef, chicken, and pork." And so this got me looking. I knew some of the literature, but it got me really diving into the literature on the comparative impacts of different kinds of food production. And, all food production has environmental impacts. It takes water. Takes fertilizer. It generates nutrient pollution. It generates sediment runoff. It generates carbon greenhouse gases. It reduces biodiversity. And when I started looking at fish in comparison to beef, chicken, and pork, it looks awfully good. Depending, the carbon footprint of fish is highly variable. Some of it is the lowest impact imaginable, particularly small pelagic fishes caught by purseines. And some of it is terrible in terms of the amount of carbon per amount of food, and particularly lobster traps. And it turns out that the carbon footprint of fish is almost directly proportional to the price of the fish. So things that are very expensive tend to take a lot of carbon, a lot of fuel to harvest. And I think it's because if they're worth a lot, you go a lot farther to catch it. But anyway, the bottom line is I started to realize that how good fish was as an environmental choice of protein. And by many measures, better than even a vegetarian diet, because vegetarian diets require clearing land and essentially eliminate the local biodiversity. So I don't remember exactly when it was. It's probably about 2016. Greenpeace launched a very public attack on me, arguing that I had not reported research that was funded by the fishing industry, because I had a lot of research, and still do, that is supported by the fishing industry. It's probably over the course of my career been maybe even now half of the funding, maybe not quite. But anyway, they said that I was not reporting it. And in fact, I had been. And they sent letters to the major journals, Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and all of them reviewed the papers and said, no, he's reported it. Their perspective was anything I did on fisheries, I had been funded by the industry. Whereas, I had our work in Bristol Bay, Alaska has been funded by the fishing industry for a long time, way back before I did work in New Zealand that was funded by the fishing industry. Anyway, so all of those, the university reviewed it, and they didn't get any traction in the U.S. because I've friends in the environmental community who, the reporters would call up and say, okay, so Hilborn, an advocate for commercial fishing paid for by the fishing, and said, no. And the other thing is that I had a lot of work on bottom trawling. Now, it was mostly funded by the Packard and Walton Foundations. We did have a little bit of industry funding in there, but, they said, well, because you've received industry funding, you should have reported that as being industry funded. Now, I think we actually did on that, but almost all of my work has had a number of co-authors. And often I'm the only one of them who's been funded by the fishing industry. And so I say, okay. And so sort of one of my favorite collaborators is a woman named Anna Parma, who's from Argentina, but a very, very high, well-respected international scientist. And she, for many years, was on the board of directors of the Nature Conservancy. So she was a co-author on all of our papers on trawling. Okay. And so, that a scientific paper most of them have many, many authors. And I am often the only one who's actually received a significant amount of money from the fishing industry.
Well, not to mention too, they all have to be peer reviewed, right? So,
the peer, yeah. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career refuting papers that were published and peer reviewed. Peer review is not a guarantee that it's right, or that it's well done, or that it's not biased.
Yeah. I mean, have you noticed with all your years? I mean, how long have you been a scientist? How long have you been doing your research for? You said 50 years?
I think my first scientific papers were published in the early 1970s. I was a PhD student in the early 1970s, and I think my first paper on fisheries was 1976. So that's 50 years, isn't it? Yeah,
something like that.
50 years. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Have you noticed a change in the culture of? Have you noticed a change in the culture of just the whole academia process? Because I have a good friend of mine who's a professor at the University of Guam. He's a biology professor. And quite honestly, I've never been exposed to it as much as I went to the military academy. It was very different. So, but he was telling me a little bit about the review process and things like that. And have you noticed in your years, 50 years, have you noticed things changing, or is it pretty much the same process?
It's pretty much the same process, but certainly in the fish world, there's become a lot of people who are scientists who are also advocates for particular issues, like stopping trawling or MPAs, etc. And so, I think there's a lot more papers that are coming out that clearly are being written from an advocacy perspective than, 50 years ago. Fisheries there just wasn't a lot of advocacy going on. I was talking to the executive director of the American Fisheries Society, and he said that the American Fisheries Society has changed enormously in the last decades, that it used to be dominated by people who work for state fish and wildlife agencies. And now it seems to be dominated by young people who are coming from a conservation perspective rather than a fisheries management perspective. And you see that. I don't see that in our graduate students as much. I mean, the sex ratio has changed enormously. Fisheries used to be, 95% male, and now it's probably 60%. If you go to a fisheries meeting, it's probably 60% women. And if you look at even the industry organizations, a lot of them are being led by women these days. I think that so that's changed a lot.
Why do you think that is? You just think women just in general, because of the role-based society, now they're just moving into more of that role, the role-based society from like in the 50s and 60s, and things are progressing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, that the barriers are down to some extent. Certainly in the science world, I mean, I think well over half of our recent hires in our department are women. And I guarantee you there's been no gender bias in the search. I mean, we're always happy to get a woman, and because we 15 years ago we were 80% men or something like that. Now I don't think we're quite 50% yet, but certainly our recent hires have been 50%. And it's just a lot more women are going into the sciences. I mean, one of my colleagues who's still active, she still comes to faculty meetings, was the first woman ever hired in our department back in probably the 70s or so. It just wasn't a profession for women back in those days.
One question, and then we can be done. We can wrap it up. But I wanted to go back to when you said your salmon project that you did up in Alaska. What was the situation? How were you able to turn that around? Like, what were some of the tools that you used to, what was some uniqueness of that fishery that allowed you to flip it around and have a success story?
Well, it's managed by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Okay. And so, I mean, they deserve the credit for the good management. I mean, our program, which started in 1946, really developed a lot of the techniques that when statehood came along, they took over. So probably the most important was how you count the fish. So we developed this technique of counting them as they swim up the rivers. And as they swim up the rivers, they hang right along the shoreline to keep out of the main current. And so what Fish and Game does is has towers on each of the major rivers. That's just a metal frame that lets somebody look down on the river, and somebody sits there for 10 minutes in every hour counting the fish as they swim by with a tallywhacker, if you know what that is. And this allows them to know exactly how many fish have gotten past the fishery towards the spawning grounds on an hourly basis. And so they have been extremely good about managing the fisheries to make sure that enough fish get up the rivers to spawn. But the fisheries have gone up and down based on environmental conditions. So we had terrible years in the early 70s. The total return to Bristol Bay was a couple million fish, and there was almost no fishing allowed. But in the last 10 years, we had a record of 82 million fish. And that's all that, I mean, you need good management. The habitat is protected. Okay. Largely because there's been no demand on it. And the only demand recently has been for a big copper mine, the Pebble Mine. And that has been rejected by, the Environmental Protection Agency so far. And so you got intact habitat, you have good management by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and we've now hit good environmental conditions.
Very nice. So do you prefer farmed over free range fish?
Oh, no. I mean, okay, farming fish is a very legitimate way to produce food. But given a choice between a wild salmon and a farm salmon, I'll take a wild salmon.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. I should have reversed that. My dyslexia kicked in there. Okay. Yeah. No, I appreciate your time, Doc. And, I'm was more than thrilled to talk to you, just to get your perspective on everything and educate
Okay, no,
myself.
I'm happy to talk to you.
I appreciate it. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely.